Good morning, everybody. I'm Ulrik Christensen. I'm a physician by training, but I've spent the last 20 years in education. It started out at the tallest building in Denmark. It's still the tallest building, and the top floor here now is one of the world's most advanced simulation centers. It was not back then. We were in a closet, and we built simulators primarily to see if we could study human factors. They look roughly like this. Those of you who have an interest in medical education will know that this is what most medical schools or nursing schools look like today. They didn't back in the early 90s, and they didn't when Bohr went to college either. But part of what we figured out was that application of knowledge was really important. But what we also found out was that there was a massive need for looking at how do we actually learn things at an earlier stage in life. That led to a relatively long journey that has taken about 20 years with partnerships with some of the most large-scale organizations and educations in the world. They're delivering certifications in everything from first aid for regular people to having developed the modern generation of adaptive learning, Learn Smart, Smart Book. Some of you may have heard about it, and actually with a bunch of the guys in the room. So now the question is, why another concept? Do we really need one more? Adaptive, personalized, differentiated, all this. In medicine, which has been leading this, there has been an attempt to use personalized medicine, but precision turned out to be a better term because it had the appeal and had the instinctive interpretation by people who are not experts in the field. We've had that problem with adaptive. One day, 7 years ago, we were trying to see if we could differentiate between adaptive could be when you mail in your responses every week and you get a response back on your assignment. That could be kind of adaptive, right? On the other end, you could have what we've been doing, adapting every 30 seconds. So we're trying to say there are adaptive systems and super adaptive systems. And then another player in the industry said, oh, we're hyper adaptive the day after. And then it becomes foolish, right? So this is an attempt to propose that at least agree on one thing, that we want to try to be precise. So I did a very, very simple Facebook experiment. I asked just my Facebook friends. I have a few, quite a few actually, and about 100 responded to this, on which of these are most precise. And of the ones that were not agreeing with number one being the most precise, they were either thinking that it was a trick question and they answered the opposite of what is obvious, or they were actually did know that that this one here, these two are equally precise, but this one is both precise and accurate. But the vast majority intuitively felt that number one was precise. That leads us to maybe this is a term we could use whether we are talking about a specific instrument in education, whether we're talking about shaping an adaptive progression of learning precisely to the individual. Maybe this is the term we could all agree on regardless of commercial interests, but this is a term that is relatively intuitively, relatively precisely interpreted the same way by everybody. And this is important because it's also the opposite of what Todd, I saw his face here in the room, wrote his book about the end of average. And if we look at what the end of average is about, it is something that is extremely central to what medicine realized about 20 years ago, when there was a massive move away from the standardized education of everybody towards really trying to solve this problem. To Errors Human is an Institute of Medicine report from the late 90s, I think it's 98, that showed that there was 98,000 preventable deaths due to human error. That was earth-shattering in medicine, where we really realized we had to change the way we were teaching, we had to change the way we were testing, and we had to change our entire approach to the fact that, wow, this human factors aspect of this was really, really important. If this happened on one day, we would shut down healthcare. Todd has, in parallel with this, spent the last years proving and giving various examples and doing great work explaining why using average as a predictor for individual needs is the same as designing systems for nobody. So to Ted's talk right before this about, do we even try to hit the right target? We may be better at designing educational systems for people that will never have the need for what we're educating them for in the future. Again, precision might actually be the way forward there. This is another example, research we did in math, where the top part is a math equation, the bottom part is the solution, and this is just short of 900 students solving this problem. It's actually only the students of those 900 who eventually got it right that are on this graph. which is about 2/3 of them, and I'll break it down later. But what is interesting in this is that every single edge here between two nodes represents a correct mathematical step. That means that there probably is no golden way to solve this problem. It probably isn't a good idea to design an educational system that tries to get everybody to follow the middle route. Because what is the real thing you need to learn here is, it may actually be, and we've proved that back in the 19s that that's a big problem in medicine as well, that when you meander out here, maybe you need the recovery mechanism to get back towards the result, rather than you need to remember the specific steps from here to here. So many educational systems are trying to fit everybody into the same mold of average or middle of the road, where I actually think that if we change the approach to being able to buffer and accept that students are so vastly different. Think about if you did this with 200,000 students, you would see a lot more crazy net here. So that's the first part. Just on simple, basic learning objectives like math, medicine, these other things that are very tangible, they're all in the knowledge domain. But it gets even worse. What happens if not all students are alike in terms of their motivation? This may actually be the single most important factor to address. Not how you learn math, not how you teach medicine, not how we test for it, but how do we actually get students to engage in the first place? Because the result of this is, the result of an education system is the product of their motivation and the quality of the system. In other words, their willingness, if you were in medicine, we would say, we both have to make a good pill, and we have to get the patients to actually take them at the appropriate amounts and when we want them to take them. This guy is unusual. Not only is he won an Olympic gold medal in London, he is about to graduate as a physician. He's gotten 2 kids on the way, held the world record for 10 years, and his wife is going to Tokyo as well for her 5th Olympic. Unusual family, right? So the thing with this guy is that this is not his daily life. This was very much part of the journey there, and we cannot expect this from the average student. We have to be able to build and shape systems that precisely are able to accommodate that students have varying degrees of motivation, and we have to vary the way we motivate them. Or actually, maybe more important, with one of the few things you can learn from management literature, maybe you could learn from Good to Great that the most important thing is not to demotivate students. And that requires, again, a very targeted and precise approach. In other words, most weak students are lost. They're like this, I think it's a fox. I'm not very good at spotting these animals. But I think it's a fox, and I think it's from Greenland. I'm quite sure it is. The thing is that they're poking around. They're trying to find a small nugget here or there, a little bit of appreciation, a little bit of food, if it's the fox, and a little bit of a tap on the back. That's not enough. We have to design a system that is able to meet them where they are, precisely where they are, whether it's a matter of what they need to be going to, whether it's a matter of how we do it, whether it's a matter of how we handle the motivation, and why. Before we move on to that, I'd like to just highlight one person who spent, together with Carol Drake, a really significant amount of her career on this. Angela Duckworth has written not only this important book about it, but she's also made an organization, characterlab.org, which is working on instruments to measure this. Why? And why are all these instruments so important? Leap innovation is similarly important, measuring where are we on a personalization scale. Angela is working on where are we on a motivation scale. How do we measure grit? Why is that so important that we measure it? Because unless we have a tape measure, it's very hard to measure anything precisely if we're trying to cut some wood, right? So we need these tape measures. We need this concept of being able to behave precisely and accurate and in a scientific way around these things. So why is it so important? It's important because it can be really, really ugly if you miss the target. Being serious again, this is the same set of data as I showed before in math. When we gave students who have been taught math in school for 9 years, we gave them a math problem. The math problem you saw. These are struggling students. I have to say that. This is developmental math students, so they are not good enough to be accepted straight into college. But still, this is after 9 years of math. 1/3 of them did it correctly in the first pass. Then we gave very, very targeted, completely individualized, adaptive, whatever you want to call it, precisely to their need. We gave them feedback, and we were able to cut the problem by half within a few minutes. And it was not because we taught them how to navigate from A to B. We taught them how to fix the problem they made in the first place. And then they were able to solve a similar problem where they didn't necessarily make the same mistake. So we're not just teaching them the recipe for solving the problem, we only targeted the mistake they made the first time. A fourth aspect of this is what Anders Ericsson has been working for his entire career. It's actually not completely true. From about the mid-90s on deliberate practice. Initially, he was studying how expert memorizers, how people became experts. But a large part of this aspect led to, or this research led to, trying to understand what actually, what are the commonalities among these experts? And the number one thing he found was the concept of deliberate practice. There are actually ways where his research could be implemented really, really concretely into handling students where they are at. And the most important one of them is, how do you move students from being unconsciously incompetent to getting into a learning zone where they need to learn? And it's very, very different what triggers students to do this. So you have to touch them exactly when they're making a mistake, and then you have to ask them, in this case, that's what we do, we ask them, how sure are you about this actually? If you then measure that systematically over time, you get a very precise measure of where's this student's very nuanced strengths and weaknesses. Very concretely, this is a screenshot from the New England Journal of Medicine platform we made, where every time we asked people a question, we've done this for years in 1,600 products or something like that with McGraw-Hill, we asked them this simple thing at the bottom. Initially, there was some pushback against this, but this is a really, really simple but very powerful intervention to be able to measure individual differences much more concretely. I'll give you a very concrete example you can go home and do if you have kids at home and you're practicing spelling words. Think about this situation. You're practicing 50 spelling words with your son or daughter. He or she gets 10 of them wrong, 40 of them right. It's very obvious that you re-practice the 10 they got wrong, right? But among the 40 they got right, if you take 10 kids and do this, among the 40 they got right, they will all vary on which of them they were actually in doubt about and which of them you probably should revisit as well. But unless you revisit all 40, you don't have a chance to catch those in the gray zone. So do something super simple with your kids. You ask them to show 3 fingers if they're sure about how to spell it, 2 fingers if they're in doubt, and 1 finger if they just want to give it a shot or they have no idea. Very, very simple. It doesn't slow down spelling words, except for one thing. Sometimes you'll see something interesting happening. You'll see 2 fingers that after about 5 seconds become 3 fingers. And what happened? Best bet, after I've talked to my daughters about it and a number of other kids for years, is that they spelled the word in their head and they could see that it was the right spelling, and now they're sure, which is a very powerful indication, right? So what does that tell us now? We should look at all the 2s as well. All the ones where they got it right but they were in doubt about it, let's go back to those as well, because there's a fair risk that they're just as much in doubt about it the day after when they're doing their test at school. Not saying it's the right way to do it, but that's the way it works right now. That they're doing it the day after in school. So therefore, it's extremely important to actually get this kind of rating to be able to differentiate where do I spend my time among the 40 words that apparently were fine. So this is an example of how you can build a precision instrument into a very concrete learning product. And it is a massive problem. This is on higher education data, and this is a very large data set. There are almost 400,000 students in it, where 17% of all answers submitted, and this was among the a total population where they actually, in some cases, they've been remediated and they first got it wrong and then they got it right. So it's even diluted compared to first passes, 17%. We did a first pass analysis with one of the large corporate clients we have, and the number was astronomical. It was in the vicinity of twice as big for professionals that are dealing with a central part of the technology we use in our lives every day. When you ask them questions about their own products, they would be unconsciously incompetent in a very, very high percentage of the cases. And this is a top performing company. Think about it, if we were able to work systematically with this, that's of course the reason why this company is one of the top performing companies, that they are not going to leave this alone. They are on this as pit bulls and trying to change this. This is another example that is really interesting, that if you take a precision approach, or in this case it's an adaptive approach, but it doesn't have to be that to be precise. There are many ways to be precise. Adaptive, personalized, differentiated are just among the tools in the toolkits we have. This is from New England Journal of Medicine's still unpublished data, but I've been allowed to show them. Only been showed once before. That if you perform at these are deciles, these are sciences, so they're almost impossible to read these graphs. But these are deciles. So this means that if you're in this range, 51 to 60%, you have almost 90% chance of passing, somewhere in between here. But look at this. What if you get to the 81 to 90%? You're very close to 100% chance of passing. These are diluted data even. And the reason why is that these data, and the reason why they haven't been published yet, is that these data are made in a situation where everybody who did not get recertified is counted as somebody who we lost here. So we have some people here who may not ever have shown up to recertify that are diluting this data, that actually were in this category. So corrected for this, we know that we'll end up very, very high up here. Linear regression gives us a really, really high percentage, very close to 100%. What does that mean for the future of the board exams in medicine? They might be going away. My prediction is it's the first place where we're going to see the biggest impact of continuous certification or continuous maintenance of certification. I think that will be in internal medicine. Just my prediction. What is also interesting is that there is a correlation between the users who use practice exams. That's interesting for those of you who work with test prep systems, that in this case, there is a really high correlation for the practice exams and whether they performed in the final test. But the thing was, you didn't have to do this. This is a superfluous thing because you could just use the training environment. And I want to leave enough room for questions. And if you don't have questions, I have multiple war stories to tell. One of the things that we've worked mostly on the last years is how do we move from a situation where how do we measure these things? How do we do science on it? And one of the problems we have is that when we do science on these things, we're not up against an established standard. We can take these tests and show that are the tests, or can we make people perform better on the established tests? If you take the internal board of, the American Board of Internal Medicine, their board exam covers somewhere in the vicinity of 125,000 learning objectives. And that's not even counting pre-med, the learning objectives that are prerequisites for many of them. They ask you 400 questions. What is the problem with that? The problem with that is that you have an enormous gearing between, for each test item, you need to infer what they know about, do the math quickly, about 55 other things, roughly, right? Something that was in above 50 other things. So one test question needs to tell us that we think they're proficient in 50 other things. That's really, really hard to do with one question, right? So when we have these kind of issues, it makes it impossible to do anything but either make some tests. You can improve this a little bit, sorry, if you do differentiated testing. So if you make some of them a little bit harder, you can improve this ratio maybe a factor of 2. You're still having a monumental problem. What is the alternative? The alternative is that you do ongoing testing over a period of time. So let's say that you spread it out so that you ask everybody to do 15 minutes of practice precisely on what they need to learn every week. So you differentiate every week which of the 125,000 things that they test. That they are getting tested or that they're revisiting. What then is important is, what if you then cut down the 125,000 to the 60,000 or the 40,000 things that are really important? So you actually went through it and figured out what is really important in order to maintain your certification as a physician, or what is really important if you are working at a truck making facility somewhere. If you do both at the same time, you now have both the fact that you're differentiating what is happening with people and adapting to their specific needs, but the other thing is, if we're able to cut this down and do careful learning engineering and figuring out and task analysis, what is important for these guys to maintain, you avoid the big thing that we saw when we started 20 years ago in education and in medical era research, was random things that disappeared from their heads. So why did these random things disappear from their heads? It's because if you look at, I highly recommend that you read Charles Fiddel's new book on 4-dimensional learning. In medicine, there's nothing new in it. We've always known that there was knowledge, skills, and attitude, and there was some metacognition going around. So Charles' model is knowledge, it's a Venn diagram, knowledge, skills, and he called it character, and then metacognition lies behind it. The problem is that if we think about the brain as a container, and we start by using the entire container and fill in 125,000 things, and absorb all capacity with those 125,000 things, and they begin to slip away. First of all, we filled it up originally, so nobody really practiced using these things while they're filling that container. But the second problem is when they start slipping away, there is no way to keep track of what slipped away, so it happens randomly. And then you run into situations where you're in a critical incident. That's the first place you see it. When you get under pressure, you get stressed for some reason, and suddenly you're lacking something that you can't remember, you can't retrieve, or you can't use the right way. So the first thing is, of course, to shrink how much effort you're spending with that knowledge container, that you not allow this tumor of knowledge to swell inside your brain. And there are two ways to do it. One of them is to be precise about what does an individual need, but the other one is to be precise about the curriculum, which was Ted's main point in the previous presentation. And if you do both at the same time, you will get a massive impact. Go first.
So this notion of precision in education seems right, but it's going to be built on how you design your evidence gathering, the assessment tasks, how you analyze it, and so forth. Can you say something about what you think of the way that evidence is gathered now and what you think needs to be done to improve assessment tasks and their marking to make this work better?
Yeah, I think it is the scientific rigor around developing instruments that we rely on and we trust when we measure, for instance, motivation, or we measure personalization, or we even measure how efficient do students learn math concepts. Our measurement instruments cannot be the current tests because they're not precise enough to be used in this new world. They have to be a different species. And that's why I think it is important that we keep funding and supporting organizations like LEAP and Character Lab and others who are working very systematically with giving us these instruments so that it's not a matter of who writes the best marketing material, but rather a matter of who has actually measured really precisely how it works.
So it's really resonating what you're saying about the doctor continuing education and recertification, whatever the right word is. I just talked to my brother about this over the weekend. He's a really successful orthopedic surgeon in Atlanta. He's 60. He's studying to take the orthopedic surgeon exam again. And he said exactly what you said, which he would like to have an ongoing work on it. So I can't wait to tell him that you said this. It'll be no relief to him because your ideas will not be implemented fast enough. But so on motivation, can you talk a little bit more about how motivation fits into this? Because is it because you're getting such precise feedback and so yeah, what about motivation?
So what we saw with the higher ed students was that despite the fact that they probably on average is working 10-20% harder, we see that 90+% of them find it valuable, ranging up to extremely valuable. So the three top grades, where 3 being still a positive score, 90% of them scores at that. That's kind of weird. We've looked at a lot of educational interventions and very few of them have that level of compliance. And the best answer we have based on interviewing the students about it is that as long as it feels valuable, that's the thing and it feels like they're not wasting their time with things they shouldn't be wasting their time on. So it's the lack of demotivation. And then if we look at something else, when we thought that with the maintenance of certification products with NEJM, with the New England Journal of Medicine, we would see that they would buy the really expensive, it cost $700 to buy this program. And then when they were done with their board exams, we wouldn't be hearing from them again until 7 or 10 years later. A very high percentage, I think it's 80-90%, are renewing it and keeping it current. They're paying $100 a year to keep it current because they felt that this was something that helped them and that they can see, wow, if I continue doing this, it will actually make my next research much, much easier. We'll stratify these data and say, what happens after when you know that it's your last recertification, that kind of stuff, then we probably will see them fall out. But we see that instead of badges or giving them a stupid set of pixels saying, you've answered 3 questions in a row, just make sure that it means something to them and it hits them precisely.